Good evening and welcome to a special Friday edition of The Last Word, focusing on defendant Trump. Donald Trump has not come up with a magical solution to prevent New York's Attorney General Letitia James from beginning the process of attaching his assets on Monday in order to guarantee the payment of a $464 million civil fraud judgment against Donald Trump. The merger announced today between Donald Trump's social media company with a much higher valued company called the Digital World Acquisition Corporation can do nothing to change Donald Trump's financial capacities on Monday, when Donald Trump hits the deadline for satisfying the judgment against him. If Donald Trump had $464 million, he could just post it with the court as a guarantee that he could cover the judgment if he loses his appeal of the case. But Donald Trump doesn't have that much money, despite claiming to have had much more than that for many, many years now. And Donald Trump has not been able to get anyone to lend him that money so that he could post a bond with the court for the judgment, which would then protect his assets. The court gave Donald Trump 30 days to figure this out, and he hasn't been able to. And so now, as financial reality closes in on him, Donald Trump goes to bed lying and wakes up lying. Last night at 1:54 a.m., he posted one of his familiar lies on social media, saying that the judgment against him was unconstitutional and unfair, and that it was designed by the judge to, quote, not allow me to use any of the large amount of cash I have built up over the years through hard work, insight, instinct, and diligence on my political campaign for president. So the lie there is that Donald Trump does not have hundreds of millions of dollars, just doesn't have it, and the lie that he was going to spend that money on his political campaign. That is a complete and total lie. Donald Trump has never spent one penny of his own money on any of his political campaigns. In his first campaign for president, after promising that he would finance his entire campaign himself and would never ask anyone to donate to his campaign, Donald Trump loaned a total of $10.8 million to his campaign to get it started. And then he quickly began begging for money every day of his life online to his supporters. And when his supporters sent in enough money, Donald Trump paid himself back the $10 million that he loaned to his campaign. So no, Donald Trump was not hoarding large amounts of cash, hundreds of millions of dollars, so that he could spend that money on his political campaign, as he said just before 2 a.m. last night. And then, when he woke up this morning, if he slept at all, at 7:14 a.m., Donald Trump repeated that lie, saying, I currently have almost $500 million in cash, a substantial amount of which I intended to use in my campaign for president. No, he did not. He has never intended to use one penny of his own money in his campaign. And saying that he now has almost $500 million in cash would mean that his lawyers were lying when they told the judge at the beginning of the week that it was, quote, an impossibility. That was their word, an impossibility for Donald Trump to come up with $500 million in cash. Trump's lawyers actually called that, quote, a practical impossibility. The Trump lawyers explained to the court just how thoroughly Donald Trump failed in coming up with the money. The lawyers said, quote, these diligent efforts have included approaching about 30 surety companies through 4 separate brokers. A bond requirement of this enormous magnitude, effectively requiring cash reserves approaching $1 billion, is unprecedented for a private company. So, in a Manhattan courtroom on Monday, the foundational lie of Donald Trump's image building as a politician will be exposed.
I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I don't need anybody's money. I'm using my own money. I'm not using the lobbyists. I'm not using donors. I don't care. I'm really rich.
That was an enormous part of Donald Trump's initial appeal when he began as a candidate. He mounted other appeals, including direct appeals to racists, to expand his base of support. But many Trump voters in Iowa believed then and said then in interviews that the Trump wealth that they believed he had was a virtue. They believed he would be incorruptible because he had too much money already to be corrupted. Donald Trump was lying about that. And his voters were wrong to believe it. But they have forgiven or overlooked every Trump lie that has been exposed. And so at the end of the day on Monday, most of them might still be willing to believe that Donald Trump is as rich as he has always pretended to be. But Donald Trump knows better. And Donald Trump has proved how rich he isn't to anyone who can think. The world's famous billionaires have no problem coming up with $500 million. Jeff Bezos has that in his pocket. Bill Gates has given away more money than Donald Trump has ever had in his life. Bill Gates has given away billions of dollars. And the real billionaire New York politician, former mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, who has also given away billions of dollars, never brags about his wealth. He could easily cover a sudden bill of $500 million at any time from his current holdings of $106.2 billion. Mike Bloomberg started with nothing, grew up in suburban Boston, moved to New York City, had to work to make every single penny he has earned, had to do it on his own. Donald Trump hates billionaires like Mike Bloomberg, who came to the big city where Donald Trump was born rich and left Donald Trump far behind in the building of important businesses and the accumulation of wealth that staggers Donald Trump's poisoned imagination. Donald Trump has never dared to even pretend that he is as rich as Mike Bloomberg. Never mind the younger men like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, who have hit the stratospheric level of wealth that Donald Trump seethes with jealousy about every day of his life. The drama Donald Trump is living through now, the drama he's living through tonight, the drama that we are all watching, was foretold when the presidential election was called for Joe Biden and Donald Trump officially entered the history books as a loser. On that day, Peter Marks, the drama critic of the Washington Post, wrote, "I imagine it as a chilling final turn of the plot. His world is coming to an end. He will never have another good day. Loser label will haunt him. The law will pursue him. Mental illness will hobble him. His properties will bankrupt him." Leading off our discussion tonight is Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion and author of Trump Nation. He is host of the Bloomberg podcast, Crash Course, and an MSNBC political analyst. Also with us, Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. He is the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Trump Indictments. Andrew Weissmann, as we close in on Monday, what will you be looking for on Monday?
The trial date. I think looking at the papers, leaving aside one caveat, which is that one of Donald Trump's lawyers is really a superb ethical lawyer, so you never want to sort of counter out. I'm going to be interested in seeing what Susan Necheles, that defense lawyer, has to say, what arguments she makes. But having read the papers on both sides, this really looks like a sort of minor kerfuffle. I think the judge will be focused on, is there anything there that's going to take more than the 30 days that he is granted, and whether the judge will stick with essentially this trial starting on, ironically, given your opening and what you talked about, April 15th. But I sort of expect that we will get a trial date that is, if not that date, shortly thereafter.
So, Tim O'Brien, in the civil case now, which enters this new zone of the $454 million collection period, we get the feeling from the outside. You've dealt with Donald Trump up close. He sued you for telling the truth about how rich he wasn't. You won, of course. You get the feeling that he doesn't actually feel, he can't anticipate danger properly. That's why he went bankrupt in Atlantic City. The ability to anticipate risk is what saves businesses from disaster. It saves all areas of life from disaster. He seems surprised that it has come to this.
Yeah, you know, business is risk management. Banking is risk management. Managing money is risk management. He and I were walking around Mar-a-Lago once in around 2005, talking about when he almost went personally bankrupt in the early 1990s. And he said, you know, my father always said to me, never personally guarantee any loans. And I made a mistake. I personally guaranteed too much money in the early 1990s. I didn't think it would catch up with me, and it did. And I learned my lesson. I decided I'd never personally guarantee a loan again after that. I later found out that he was lying to me in that very moment. I didn't know it, but it turned out he had personally guaranteed some of the loans on a new building he was developing in Chicago. That only came out a few years later. So he goes through these searing moments where he almost loses everything he has, and he says, I've learned these lessons and I should have listened to my father. And then lo and behold, he's doing the same old thing. And now here we are in 2024, and he is about to get exposed. It's going to be a slow grind. I don't think there's going to be a lot of drama on Monday, but the process of opening the kimono and discovering that indeed Donald Trump has no financial clothing, at least not the kind of financial clothing he's claimed he's had, begins. And it is a demonstration that he doesn't learn his lessons, he doesn't anticipate problems properly, and he doesn't do it because he's a juvenile delinquent. He lacks the maturity and the wisdom and the strategic insight of an adult.
And Andrew, Barbara Jones' role in this that's been expanded by Judge Engoron includes the following. It says that she should monitor in advance any efforts to secure surety bonds. So that would mean if anything was going on this weekend, you have to go through her first or in the last few days. And it says she also has the authority to examine any representations made by the Trump Organization in connection with securing such bonds. So, Andrew, that seems to indicate that whatever goes on here cannot be done secretly. Even some magical multi-billionaire angel who wants to come in and drop that money in Donald Trump's pocket, it seems Barbara Jones would have to know about that.
That's absolutely right. And so people understand Barbara Jones is a former federal prosecutor who for years served as an Article III federal judge in the Southern District of New York and has been engaged in oversight of the Trump Organization. Judge Engoron, in the civil fraud case, has expanded her role to, as exactly you said, making sure that there are no financial shenanigans going on, because the judge has found that there was a history of fraud and financial shenanigans. And so he's trying to make sure that does not repeat itself. So she will be overseeing whether, for instance, there's a purported sale of an asset with, which was not really at market value, making sure that there is no fraud going on to at the last minute somehow manufacture the sum of money that Donald Trump needs. I would also just point out the stupidity of Donald Trump saying today that he actually has the money. He has pending before the court an application where the application to the court is, please lower the bond amount because I cannot pay it. And at the same time, he has said, I can pay it. So just put yourself in the shoes of the judges who have that application before them. Do you think they would grant that based on the defendant now saying, oh, I can actually pay it? I mean, one way or the other, somebody is lying about that.
Yeah, I've never seen a stupider litigant in court on a very consistent basis. And Andrew, let me take you back to the criminal prosecution you're talking about in Manhattan, which is obviously going to be the first criminal prosecution of Donald Trump. And it's pretty clear that it is going to happen, if not in April, certainly by May. And with the latest pleadings we've seen in this case, that concern the recently developed evidence that the district attorney is saying, look, there isn't much there. It's largely duplicative. It doesn't require a lot of time to modify the defense in a way that includes that new evidence. So we are going to know. Do you expect that we will have a trial date set soon, or might the trial date discussion be continued for a bit?
It is possible, but, this is a serious judge, and he clearly was not happy about this predicament. I would be surprised if we don't hear something on Monday, if not Tuesday, about the trial date. I just think the papers that were submitted by the DA's office are so thorough, because they gave so many affidavits as to what precisely happened, that I just think it narrows the issues for the judge on Monday, that I'd be surprised that he doesn't just, hear from the defense, rule on it, and then say this is the trial date and give everyone advance warning. That's what I would anticipate.
And Tim, to Donald Trump, who apparently his mind works like a junkie's. He only deals with the thing in front of him at that moment, right? So when we get past the whole issue of what's happening with the collection of the $500 million, for any other person, the looming criminal trial that is right behind it, would be really top of mind now. It seems like his brain won't even start to worry about that until it's a couple of days before going to trial. And
in which he might have to testify. Yeah. And he is a lawyer's worst nightmare on the stand. He bloviates, he lies, he doesn't stay on script, and undoubtedly he's not listening to any advice he's getting from them right now. It is the legal equivalent of what he does financially and in his business life, which is to not anticipate the freight trains that are rolling towards him in an existential way, and he just doesn't know what to do.
Tim O'Brien's going to stick with us to guide us through more of this. Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for starting off our discussion tonight. And a podcast note, as Donald Trump's first criminal trial in Manhattan approaches, as Andrew just told you, you can now listen to the key excerpts of that indictment, read by Tony, Emmy, and Golden Globe winner Glenn Close.
On the hush money payments, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. One component of the scheme was that, at the defendant's request, a lawyer who then worked for the Trump Organization as special counsel to defendant, Lawyer A, covertly paid $130,000 to an adult film actress shortly before the election to prevent her from publicizing a sexual encounter with the defendant.
The special two-part Trump Indictments edition of the Prosecuting Donald Trump podcast, covering all 4 criminal indictments, read by Glenn Close, Liam Neeson, Peter Coyote, Renee Elise Goldsberry, is available now wherever you get your podcasts. And coming up, what is going to happen on Monday? Where is Attorney General Letitia James going to send the sheriff, literally send the sheriff, to begin collecting from Donald Trump? That's next. New York Attorney General Letitia James' first move against Donald Trump's assets might be at the most liquid assets, beginning, of course, with cash. The New York Times reports she could send so-called restraining notices to Mr. Trump's banks and brokerage firms, effectively freezing his accounts. She could do the same to anyone who owes Mr. Trump money, essentially collecting rent from tenants in his building. Here is what former New York Assistant Attorney General Adam Pollack said last night on this program about what we can expect to see next week.
what we should see on Monday, or we should see after the expiration of the deadline, is a few devices used to enforce the judgment. One is bank executions. The Attorney General can enlist the sheriff or the marshal, kind of a Wild West meets New York City, to go execute on banks, on assets held in financial institutions like banks or others.
What does execute mean?
So execute, nobody's dying,
right?
But the assets get seized by the sheriff and turned over to the Attorney General's office, to the state of New York.
Right away.
Right away.
No judicial process involved.
The statute says forthwith.
Politico reports that after going after Trump's bank accounts, Attorney General James would likely then move on to seizing either Trump's personal property, planes, cars, jewelry, artwork, or real estate, such as Trump Tower, 40 Wall Street, or the Trump National Doral Golf Resort. Joining us now is Mark Sauter, a veteran New York business litigator who has secured many appeals bonds, and Tim O'Brien is still with us. Mark, the sheriff is coming. Literally, the sheriff is coming.
Well, he doesn't wear a hat or draw
got a badge here.
Badge. You know, we picture in our mind's eye that come Monday, if there's no bond posted, you're going to have little people running around the city, you know, from the sheriff's office, putting padlocks on real estate. That's not going to happen. We're going to have a lot of paper shuffling. And as your last night's guest said, there are processes there, but it's going to take a little longer, I believe, that was outlined. So these devices that were referenced can be used simultaneously. So let's go after the low-hanging fruit. That's the bank accounts, right? Well, here's what happens. So you deliver a piece of paper to the sheriff. It's called an execution. The paper is brought to the bank. That's called a levy. That secures in priority the Attorney General's position on those accounts. The restraining order that you've served sometimes only preserves it for some other creditor that comes first. You have to perfect, you have to have that levy. And then if the money is not turned over, which it normally is not until there is what's called a turnover proceeding brought, which is an order from the court that's sought to turn over the proceedings to the Attorney General. So it happens, but it happens not in a nanosecond. At the same time, she will be turning her attention to real estate, but that's tricky. Remember, she can only get her hands on and order the sale of the interests that Mr. Trump has. Now, you take 40 Wall Street, for example, which we've seen talked about a lot in the media. He doesn't own the building. He has a ground lease. So since he doesn't own
he leases the ground the building is on.
He leases it to, yes, the tenant is the owner of the building. Yeah. So she can come in and foreclose on it, so to speak. The sheriff will levy on it, and it will be put off at auction at the best value. Who's going to buy it, and how much are they going to pay for it? Or she might get an order from the court called a charging order, where she can keep temporarily the fees that are coming in from the tenant, the building owner. But he doesn't own it. In other situations, the real estate he's owned is owned by various corporations, and he has an interest in corporations that have interest in those corporations. You can't get that real estate sold that way. All that can happen is the Attorney General.
It's because buyers don't want a transaction that complicated.
Yes, and they don't want a minority or even an interest in stock in some company that may have liabilities. They don't know. It's like when you, in a business transaction, you may want to buy an asset, but you're not going to buy stock because you don't know what liabilities go with the assets. So it's going to take time.
Tim O'Brien, I am shocked. Donald Trump doesn't own what he says he owns. Right. I am shocked. I thought he owned 40 Wall Street. He's got this new deal that he's happy about, this merger with his website. His website is worth nothing on the day of the merger, but there's no way that's going to affect his financial picture on Monday.
It absolutely won't. He's locked up from selling the shares for 6 months anyway. The value of the shares are going to be variable over time. So anyone attaching that at an asset, it's not going to be something that's going to be attractive to them because they can't actually predict what the value of it will be over time once it's publicly traded. And Trump's own, the SPAC itself, they've all been full of speculative collapses. The operating numbers of this particular company are not great. It is riding on the gas of Trump's name being attached to it. And as Mark just pointed out, Trump's name being attached to something doesn't necessarily mean permanent value or ownership. There's a number of buildings in New York, the Trump International Tower at Columbus Circle. GE owns that, not Donald Trump. A German family owns the land under 40 Wall Street. Trump Tower, most of it is owned by the condo owners who own the apartments in that tower. He controls some of the commercial space in the basement and his own condo, but he doesn't own the whole building. And
Mark, I got to ask you about it. We've been talking about Donald Trump's inability to anticipate risk, anticipate danger, anticipate where he's going to hit the wall. You've represented clients in situations like this where the judgment has gone against them. At what point in the proceedings do you tell your client, if this judgment goes against you, here's what the proceedings are going to be, here's what you're going to face? I would suspect you tell them that early in the process, like somewhere in the first week or so they can think about, is there a settlement? There's a lot of things to think about when you understand what the risk is.
100%. It's probably the first conversation after you get your retainer.
Okay.
So, absolutely. So if I could add to what my colleague...
So what would you have said in a case like this involving, okay, there's business fraud here, the Attorney General has what they have. If the judge finds against you, what would you have told your client early on in a case like this?
Well, I'd tell them what would happen. I'd go through these steps. If you lose, I'd try to give an honest view of the merits of the case as I understand it. And sometimes a client will ask, well, if I lose, can they get my assets and can I do anything about it? I say, that's not what I'm representing you for. And if he wants to do things that involve planning to get his assets out of the jurisdiction, some clients do. I don't get involved with that. I'm sure Mr. Trump has had extensive counseling about his assets at this point. And by the way, on Monday, this merger where he's going to get stock, it's not going to do him any good. The court won't take it. Court only wants cash. A bonding company is not going to take it to issue a bond because it's speculative. And if they took it and 2 years from now they had to pay out, what would it be worth? So, finally, it's going to be attached by Letitia James. The money will go to her if there's money. Right. So it's nothing.
We've got to leave it there. Mark Sauter and Tim O'Brien, thank you both very much for this important discussion. I'm learning so much that I didn't know. Coming up, the worst of the civil trial penalties that Donald Trump faces could still be ahead of him as he faces multiple lawsuits over the January 6th attack on the Capitol that he incited. Those cases could cost Donald Trump several $100 million in judgments against him. Congressman Eric Swalwell is one of the people suing Donald Trump for what happened on January 6th. He'll join us next. Other lawsuits on Donald Trump's legal horizon in Washington, D.C. could cost him several $100 million. Last year, a Washington, D.C. jury returned a judgment of $148 million against Rudolph Giuliani for defamation. Imagine how big a dollar judgment a Washington, D.C. jury might return against Donald Trump for the physical injuries suffered by police officers on January 6th who are now suing Donald Trump for that. A Washington, D.C. jury decided that Rudolph Giuliani must pay Georgia poll workers Ruby Freeman and Wanda Shea Moss $148 million for lying about them. Jurors drawn from the same jury pool will decide 5 different lawsuits filed against Donald Trump for causing the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Congressman Eric Swalwell filed one of those lawsuits and will join us in a moment. Another group of members of Congress filed another lawsuit, and police officers have filed 3 lawsuits against Donald Trump for injuries they suffered on January 6th. The trial juries in those cases will be hearing testimony like this.
What we were suggested that day was like something from a medieval battle. We fought hand to hand, inch by inch, to prevent an invasion of the Capitol by a violent mob intent on subverting our democratic process. My fellow officers and I were committed to not letting any rioters breach the Capitol. It was a prolonged and desperate struggle. The rioters attempted to breach the Capitol were shouting, "Trump send us. Pick the right side. We want Trump. I, too, was being crushed by the rioters. I could feel myself losing oxygen and recall thinking to myself, this is how I'm going to die, defending this entrance.
Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He served as an impeachment manager in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Congressman Swalwell. The cases involving the January 6th attack on the Capitol, all of those civil suits for which you have won, these might be the cases that do finally bankrupt Donald Trump.
There's so many victims in these cases, and Lawrence, as you mentioned, we have not, set out a dollar amount. We're principally seeking accountability, and ultimately it's up to a jury as to, what that dollar amount is if Donald Trump is found guilty for inciting and aiming the mob. But, the plaintiff class is so large. And as you said, when you compare it to the Giuliani verdict, the exposure is certainly pretty great. And what I hope people at home take comfort in is that for years, there's been this frustration that Donald Trump has escaped responsibility and accountability. And finally, even as slow as these cases are moving, and they're moving too slow, accountability is coming for Donald Trump. And perhaps, that's how we can redeem the rule of law in our country.
Yeah, we're going to see some accountability on Monday, and that's why the judicial system has two components, civil and criminal. Sometimes criminal moves faster than civil. Sometimes civil moves faster than criminal. Here we've seen this case brought by the Attorney General was actually years in the making, but this year it seemed to move quite quickly compared to what people were seeing on the criminal side.
And Lawrence, frankly, our criminal and civil justice system was not built for a legal terrorist like Donald Trump. He is a professional litigant. I mean, there may not be another person in America who has had their name attached to more lawsuits than Donald Trump. And through 40 years of experience in the legal system, he's learned how to grind it down and to delay, and obstruct. And he's been somewhat successful. And frankly, we have to look beyond Trump as to what do we do when someone like Trump comes along in the future. Adam Schiff, I think, has the best proposal here. He has a bill called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which creates kind of a fast track when you have cases involving an executive or a former executive so that someone isn't able to grind it out like this and then perhaps win an election and then make their liability go completely away.
So the first thing that Donald Trump is already in the process of bankrupting is his own presidential campaign, the Biden-Harris campaign raising much more money than the Trump campaign. Biden-Harris campaign spending it all on campaigning. The Trump campaign spending it on Donald Trump's lawyers.
Yeah, and Lawrence, again, these folks, so many of them through small contributions, put their faith in a man who's promised that he's going to make their lives better. And all he's done is made his own life, better. And when Donald Trump looks at the word America, it has 7 letters in it, and he only sees one, the letter I. And that's why we have to make it clear this election in November for Donald Trump is entirely about escaping accountability. And is to the degree that Joe Biden can show that for him, the election is about seeing everybody and governing for everybody, I think he can win on that. And that's going to become even more pronounced as more and more cases come, for Donald Trump and we get closer to November.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
And coming up, if the Republican Party pays Donald Trump's legal fees, could Donald Trump have to pay taxes on that money as taxable income? We'll discuss that with Tim O'Brien and Daniel Shaviro, professor of taxation at NYU Law School. That's next. So at 10:17 p.m. tonight, when Donald Trump was no doubt alone in a room in that home in Florida that he cannot afford, so he had to turn it into a hotel and a restaurant to be able to live there himself, he was no doubt staring at the TV at the exact moment, 10:17 p.m., when Tim O'Brien on this program, who will rejoin our conversation in a moment, was talking about how horrible a witness Donald Trump would be if he tried to testify in his own defense at his first criminal trial, which Andrew Weissmann had just told us will be beginning in April or possibly at the latest in May. And at that moment, at 10:17 p.m., Donald Trump posted on his social media network, "Abuse of power!" exclamation point. That's how Donald Trump's Friday night is going. The Biden-Harris presidential campaign has a massive financial advantage over the Trump campaign for two reasons. One, the Biden-Harris campaign is setting records for fundraising. And two, the Trump campaign and the Republican Party are spending massive amounts of money to pay for Donald Trump's lawyers, who he presumably cannot afford to pay himself. Ignored by the media in that transaction of paying for Donald Trump's lawyers are the legalities involved in using campaign money to pay for criminal defense lawyers and the possible income tax implications to Donald Trump, who is, in effect, receiving those millions of dollars first as income to him, which he then disperses to his lawyers when they give him their bills. Joining us now is Daniel Shaviro, professor of taxation at New York University Law School, and Tim O'Brien is back with us. Professor Shaviro, there are two governing entities that have an interest in this. One of them is a weak entity, the Federal Elections Commission, which has basically abdicated enforcement because it's stuck in a standoff between the Democratic members of it and the Republican members. So they don't really enforce anything anymore. But what does the Federal Election Commission say in their rules that they don't enforce about this money, about using campaign money to pay lawyers?
Well, that's not, I'm more knowledgeable about the tax than about that, but I've researched that a little bit, and they have the so-called irrespective rule. So it has to be litigation that would be occurring irrespective of whether the person was running for office. Now, I think there's just no doubt, well, I hate to opine on federal election law, but there's no doubt that they're paying for the Trump legal case about the insurrectionist and the 14th Amendment, that was legit. But something else, like, for example, the Jean Harris trial, it's just totally different.
The E. Jean Carroll trial. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jean Carroll trial. Yeah. And that is highly likely, from what I know about election law, to be illegal. On the other hand, as you point out, it's not going to be interpreted. So maybe the tax law, though we're not sure that's going to be enforced either here, that might be a more salient way to look at it.
Yeah, so on the tax question, the IRS and tax law, they don't care what the FEC says or anyone else says about what income is and what it isn't. They have their own definitions of income. How does the IRS see this?
Well, I think the IRS, the actual IRS, is probably lying low on this. But if you ask how should the IRS see it from the point of view of enforcement, it's really not one question. It's a bunch of questions. And the reason is that there are a bunch of different expenditures. Again, there's really no chance that he has taxable income, I think, on having the Republican National Committee pay for his defending his right to be on the ballot without regard to the merits of that claim of the Supreme Court decision. On the other hand, when he has a personal lawsuit because he sexually assaulted and then defamed someone, that's a little bit different. So I think the tax question, kind of, when they give him money, if they give him money to pay for something that's deductible, it really doesn't matter because the income is offset by the deduction. On the other hand, if they gave him money to pay for his groceries, that would be income and no deduction. So we have to look at the different criminal and civil trials and kind of see where they are. And it seems to me to be pretty clear that when you're defending yourself against defamation and based on sexual assault, the tax standard for deducting legal fees that you pay is called the origin of the claim rule. So there was a corporate executive who had a divorce, and his wife wanted to take half of the stock in the divorce, and he said he would then lose control of the company, be fired as CEO, and he therefore needed to deduct fighting her in the divorce. And the Supreme Court said, we don't care if that's true or not. It's the origin of the claim. This claim, the legal fees, came from your defending a divorce, and that's a personal matter. So I think that just clearly applies to the civil suit in New York, where he just faced $88 million of liability. Now, on the other hand, the thing that you've been talking about and that everyone's been thinking about the suit on Monday, that is his paying for that is probably deductible in respect to his business. I mean, to give it an analogy, if Tony Soprano is indicted under the federal racketeering laws, I think Tony Soprano can probably deduct paying his legal fees. So again, here, having someone else pay them and not including it because you can deduct what it was done for, it makes it a wash. Now, some of the other cases are in different settings. For example, you were talking about the Washington civil trials that are yet to come. And of course, we know all about the other criminal trials. And on those, I think he has a pretty good case for deducting it. But on the other hand, it's not ironclad. There are actually counter arguments against saying that he has to include it, which would probably take 5 or 10 minutes more to explain. But on the New York civil defamation, I just don't see any chance it's not taxable income.
Tim O'Brien, taxable income is not the first thing Donald Trump thinks about when people give him money.
No, and he's bleeding small donor contributions. Mm-hmm. And that's been the lifeblood of his campaign fundraising. And it may be that all of these shenanigans are starting to register with all the little people who've been giving Donald Trump money in the idea that he's actually carrying their values and their needs into the world instead of just lining his own wallet and paying off his lawyers with that money. And I have to wonder, in the midst of all this, where's the FEC?
Well, they gave up enforcement years ago. It's this horrible political jam that they're in because they're supposed to have an equal number of Democrats appointed, an equal number of Republicans appointed. In the past, they all had the same attitude toward running clean campaigns and making sure that laws were observed. The Republicans have blocked every single enforcement they've tried to do there at the FEC.
But couldn't someone bring a complaint to them nonetheless that the FEC would be compelled to take a look at?
They have, people do file complaints, and the Republicans blocked the procedure within the FEC, which they control. Either side can control that procedure. We could go on and on.
Another blow for good government.
About the FEC, and Donald Trump's been lucky to be there during that era. Professor Shaviro and Tim O'Brien, thank you both very much for joining this discussion. We'll be right back. Tonight's last words are taxable income.